180 days. That's how long it's been since my last flight. Since then, the world has changed quite a bit. In this video, we'll have a review of Alaska Airlines' 737-900 from Chicago to Anchorage to Portland back to Chicago. We'll talk about what it's like to fly during a pandemic to a restricted destination, why I chose Alaska Airlines, and whether it was responsible for me to travel at all. But before all that, even before we roll the intro, I'd like to take a moment to celebrate what it's like to be in the skies again. Okay, Karen, yes, I see you there. Was it responsible for me to be flying at all? There's a pandemic raging after all, and the United States is doing not so great.
We're lower than the world.
I've been advocating people not travel if they don't need to. I haven't even visited my own family since this started. My livelihood isn't dependent upon this YouTube channel. And it sickens me to see some content creators with selfies of themselves traveling while wearing their own branded face masks. So am I being a complete hypocrite here? Well, I chose this trip rather intentionally. There's two main concerns I had in order of importance. The first is my infecting others, and the second is my own health. Prior to my flight to Alaska, I quarantined for 2 weeks. Alaska at the time required a negative COVID result within 72 hours before departure. I was tested and got my negative results before I boarded. I wore a face mask the entire time. Knowing that I didn't have the virus to spread kind of defeats that argument. For when I returned, I happened to live alone. Okay, not entirely. So my risk of infecting others is minimal. As for the risks of contracting the virus myself, we have the benefit of sample selection bias. Everyone flying to Alaska has to be tested within 72 hours of departure. This means everyone will be taking extra precautions, as nobody wants to test positive when you land and have to quarantine during your vacation. And given the positivity rates in Alaska versus Chicago, if I've managed to remain clear this far, and my antibody test was also negative, I should be okay there. So yes, there is a risk to myself, but given the multiple positive cases within my own apartment building, I feel much safer in the wide open spaces of Denali. So that's how I rationalized taking this trip. Feel free to tell me how irresponsible I was in the comments down below. I saw a round trip for $240 direct from Chicago to Anchorage. Both Alaska and American had that as their basic economy price. So why did I pick Alaska? Let's go down the list. And pay attention, Doug, you might learn something here. 1. Alaska is blocking middle seats, which, regardless of a pandemic, is a nice thing to have. American is not. Side note here, let's look at the correlation between airlines blocking the middle seat and those furloughing flight attendants. It's almost as if some airlines are just better run than others. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. 2. Alaska lets you select a seat even on a Saver fare, though in the back. American does not. 3. Unfortunately, my flight back was cancelled. I called Alaska and spoke with a wonderful and friendly woman in Boise who rebooked me. She was very proactive and even noticed that I like window seats and gave them to me. While I occasionally get a US-based American agent, they are mostly overseas, and you can see my experience with them in my flight review to Barcelona, linked here. 4. The flight to Alaska is a long one. While the Alaska interiors aren't perfect, I didn't want to run the risk of a Project Oasis interior for that long of a flight. Another ding against American. 5. Alaska has free in-flight messaging on WhatsApp and iMessage. American doesn't. 6. Alaska has a 20-minute baggage guarantee. American doesn't. 7. Finally, in terms of earnings, on Alaska you earn miles based on the miles you fly. I earned 6,127 valuable Alaska miles with no status. On American with no status, it's 5 miles per dollar or 1,200 miles, with only half elite segment credit for basic economy, soon to be no credit at all. So why again should I ever fly on American when the prices are comparable?
You can look at some of these charts.
I'd love to.
Oh, you're comparing United and Delta. I'm comparing you directly to Alaska.
You can't do that. You have
Why
to go,
can't I do that?
You have to go by where, look.
Anyway, let's get to this review. I took a Lyft to O'Hare, and the driver was very well protected. I had checked in online and went through security with minimal contact. Mask usage at the airport was fairly good, though some left their noses out. Sadly, that's common even on the street. So why am I reviewing Alaska again so soon? Well, before I reviewed a legacy Virgin America A319. Alaska, being headquartered in Seattle, claims to be proudly all Boeing, though we know that's not the case. With everything going on, it's likely that Alaska will use its 737 MAXs to replace the Airbus element, which makes sense from an operationally consistent perspective.
Of course, we are one big happy fleet.
My aircraft, N453AS, bears a special livery for Go Russell, the quarterback of the Seahawks. In the past, on flights from Seattle, they'd let you board early if you're wearing his number 3 jersey. The aircraft had a fair number of empty seats. So much of Alaska's charm is their staff. After regular upgrades were processed, they handed out free first class and premium seats to active duty military and veterans. Not everyone thinks they're suckers and losers, apparently. Boarding the aircraft was no longer done by zone, but after first class was by row, starting at the back of the aircraft to minimize proximity and congestion. What a blast from the past! It's what flying was like before airlines decided to monetize early boarding. So yeah, with my Saver fare, I was actually one of the very first to board. I passed the welcome from the chief football officer himself on the way. The 737-900ER was delivered in 2014 and bears the newish Alaska interior. Still, my seat, while fairly comfortable, was clearly showing its age. Legroom was fine and better than American again, and both full and USB power is available. Curiously, even though there's no in-seat entertainment, there's still the box for it in the middle seat. I'd avoid them if at all possible. We were fully boarded quickly and pushed back 5 minutes early. The manual safety demonstration was mostly the same, though they added bits about taking your mask off before using the oxygen supply and life jackets. Alaska requires everyone over 2 to wear a mask. No exceptions. You have to agree before checking in. If you don't like that policy, don't fly them. Fortunately, the crew really didn't need to be the mask police, as compliance on all my flights was very good. There was quite the backlog to take off, but I think it was banked as we all departed quickly without waiting for another flight to land. Flying time was 6 hours and 26 minutes at 34,000 feet. This aircraft was equipped with the improved GoGo internet, with free messaging and full flight internet for $20, which I think has gone up. The crew boasted of having over 700 TV shows and movies to choose from, and I noticed some newer collections. We flew northwest, eventually crossing into Canada. In-flight service is streamlined and consistently in flux. While there's no food on offer, this week they had reintroduced seltzer water. There was none of my traditional Coke Zero, and the whole can provided this time was quite a bit smaller. It was served with a Biscoff cookie. Later, a small bottle of water was passed out. The lavatory was fine, but nothing special. We crossed back into the United States and had a beautiful view of Mount Logan. Before descending into Anchorage and landing from the north. On taxi, we passed all sorts of cargo aircraft, more on that later, before arriving at the terminal. After deplaning, the other new thing was the health check. I had already filled out everything online, so I presented my negative test results and I was on my way. If you were still awaiting results, you had to show where you were going to quarantine, and if you'd not yet been tested, they would be happy to do so for $250. After that, I was a free man. I had a fantastic week in Alaska before it was finally time to return home. My flight was at an ungodly 1:45 a.m., so even in the rain, I thought I'd do some plane spotting. I was hardly the only one with this idea. In normal times, Anchorage is the 5th busiest cargo airport in the world, and was briefly the busiest overall this year. I returned to the airport at midnight, which is normally a very busy time. However, most of the concessions were closed down, as was the upstairs area. I tried to get into the Alaska Lounge, but sadly they no longer accepted Priority Pass. The terminal has ample seating and plenty of charging areas. Given the late hour, many folks were taking a nap. A lot of people didn't have seat assignments, and there were only 112 people on board out of 162. Boarding was also very smooth, and we pushed back 10 minutes early. I could feel the crosswinds on takeoff, and the ascent was incredibly rough with a lot of lurching stomachs. Flying time was 2 hours and 56 minutes at 38,000 feet. Not much to show on this flight, honestly. I zonked out as best I could using my now favorite Turkish eye shades. Ooh, face reveal! Though I did find it a little tricky to breathe with my mask on and needed to leave a gap between the shades and mask to allow airflow. I awoke just before landing in Portland, and groggily made my way off the aircraft. On paper, it was a 50-minute connection, but we arrived quite early, and my connecting flight was the next gate over. Being pretty empty, they gave out free exit row seats at the gate, and I happily snagged one. Dawn broke just as boarding started. The exit row seats don't recline, but the extra legroom more than makes up for it. We pushed back and had a beautiful and clear takeoff from Portland, fortunately before all the wildfires. Flying time was 3 hours and 15 minutes at 35,000 feet. Not much on this flight either. I went right back to sleep and awoke over Illinois. We circled the western suburbs and landed at O'Hare. So flying Alaska Airlines during a pandemic. I actually felt safe doing it. Mask compliance was good, the seat blocking a placebo if nothing else, and the great gate staff and crew as always made it a good experience. I'm not the only one who thinks so. On the last flight while deplaning, a passenger profoundly thanked the flight attendants, saying that their job was tough enough, and with all this extra stuff and risks, even more so. I for one am happy to fly Alaska when I can, and am now mulling another trip. I wouldn't call Alaska necessarily the best domestic economy experience as it lacks in-seat entertainment. But feeling comfortable on this trip, I've got my eye on a Delta A220 flight, and we'll see how that one turns out. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click that button and please subscribe for many more flight reviews to come. I'll see you on the next one.